The detention cell hummed with the kind of sterile efficiency that suggested someone had spent entirely too much time optimizing the experience of being interrogated. Fluorescent panels cast that particular shade of light that made everyone look either guilty or mildly nauseous, which was probably the point. The human sat in a chair that had been ergonomically designed for approximately 7 different species, and consequently fit none of them correctly, spinning what appeared to be a weapon of catastrophic potential between her fingers, like a particularly dangerous fidget toy. "Where did you even get that weapon?" the guard asked, and the translator crackled with what might have been exasperation or possibly the linguistic equivalent of a migraine. The human looked up, grinned in that uniquely unsettling way humans did when they found something funny that absolutely was not, and shrugged. "Found it. You can have it back when I'm done." The guard, a Phanari whose species had evolved past the need for obvious facial expressions, and now communicated primarily through color-shifting frills, turned a shade of purple that the translator helpfully provided meant something between bureaucratic frustration and imminent violence. His forearms crossed in a configuration that suggested he had attended the same training seminar on intimidating postures across species that every security officer in the galaxy apparently graduated from. "Found it," he repeated, the translator adding a layer of digital disbelief. "You found a Class Omega restricted armament. Just lying around." "Well, not lying around exactly." The human examined the weapon with the casual interest of someone appraising a used appliance. It was more tucked away in a compartment behind some very expired ration packs, which honestly was the real crime. "Do you know how long military-grade Nutra-paste takes to ferment? Because I do now, and I have regrets." The weapon itself defied several laws of physics and at least 2 interstellar treaties just by existing. Approximately the length of a human forearm, it featured components that seemed to shift between solid and not quite solid states, depending on the viewing angle. Symbols crawled across its surface in a language that predated most current civilizations, and the entire thing hummed at a frequency that made the guard's frills itch. The Galactic Armament Registry has 37 pages dedicated to why that specific weapon should not exist, the guard said, consulting a datapad that glowed with increasingly urgent warning colors. "There are 14 civilizations whose founding mythology involves hiding that weapon. 3 separate wars were fought to ensure it stayed hidden, and you found it behind expired food." "Technically in front of the expired food," the human corrected. "The food was blocking it. I was hungry." One thing led to another. The interrogation room had been designed to contain species that could phase through matter, survive hard vacuum, and in one memorable incident, temporarily achieve a state of quantum uncertainty to escape. It had not been designed to contain the particular brand of chaos that humans brought to every situation like an unwanted party favor. The walls were lined with dampening fields that could suppress everything from telepathy to localized gravity manipulation, none of which did anything to address the fundamental problem of human stubbornness. The registration codes indicate this weapon was decommissioned 7,000 years ago. The guard continued, his frills now cycling through colors that suggested he was reading increasingly disturbing information. "After it was used to collapse 3-star systems, not destroy." Collapse, as in folded space-time into configurations that still give astrophysicists nightmares. "Sounds defective," the human said cheerfully. "Probably why someone ditched it." Someone did not ditch a weapon capable of unmaking reality. Someone performed an elaborate ritual involving 12 different species' highest security clearances to seal it away. And yet, the human held up the weapon, letting light refract through its impossible angles. "Here it is, in my hand. Looking very found." The guard's translator emitted a sound like a sigh filtered through a vocoder, having an existential crisis. "You do understand that possession of that device violates approximately 473 interstellar laws. Do you understand that I haven't actually activated it?" The human's smile widened, yet being the operative word, "because I'm very curious about what this little button does, and your detention field is making me bored, and bored humans are historically speaking a problem for everyone involved." The guard's frills went completely white, which the translator unhelpfully noted meant either total system shutdown or primal terror. Possibly both. He tapped his communicator with one hand while the other 3 reached for various security implements that would almost certainly prove useless. "Command, we have a situation in Detention 7, Human subject has acquired a Harbinger-class reality disruptor and is making casual threat, requesting immediate. He paused, frills flickering. No, I am not joking. Yes, I know they were all destroyed. Yes, I am looking at one right now. No, I will not ask her to put it down slowly because that implies she might put it down quickly, and I have seen the incident reports from human stations. The human leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, weapon still spinning lazily in her grip. So about that whole "you can have it back when I'm done" thing. I should probably mention I'm not actually done. In fact, I'm just getting started. See, I have this theory about what happens when you recalibrate the frequency modulator. And theories are really meant to be tested, scientifically speaking. The guard's frills achieved a color that did not exist in the translator's database, and probably represented something beyond conventional emotional states. Please do not recalibrate anything. Then we should probably talk about alternative arrangements. The humans, because sitting in this room is getting old, and when I get bored, my fingers get fidgety. She wiggled said fingers near what might have been controls, or might have been decorative elements. With weapons that predated modern civilization, it was genuinely difficult to tell. The guard stared at her, at the weapon, and at what his career had apparently become. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began warming up for what would inevitably be a very long day. The human just smiled, that smile again, the one that suggested she knew exactly how much chaos she was about to cause, and was looking forward to it immensely. So, she said brightly, about where I found this thing. Want to hear the whole story? It's pretty good. There's a part with space pirates. 48 hours earlier, the human had arrived at Trade Station Epsilon 9 with exactly 3 things. A cargo hauler held together by optimism and duct tape, a shipping manifest that was technically legal if nobody examined it too closely, and the kind of confidence that came from successfully talking her way out of 37 previous incidents. The station orbited a gas giant that churned with storms visible from the docking bay, which seemed appropriate given what was about to happen. Epsilon 9 catered to the kind of clientele that preferred their business transactions to occur in legally ambiguous spaces. The main concourse featured vendors, selling everything from refurbished warp cores to what were definitely not stolen historical artifacts, all operating under the polite fiction that nobody asked uncomfortable questions. The lighting was kept deliberately dim, either for ambiance, or because too much illumination would reveal exactly how many health code violations were happening simultaneously. The human's cargo delivery had gone smoothly, which should have been the first warning sign. Smooth transactions in places like Epsilon 9 typically meant someone was planning something significantly not smooth to balance the universe. She had collected her credits, purchased supplies that were almost certainly genuine, and not elaborate counterfeits, and was heading back to her ship when she noticed the derelict. It hung in the station's salvage bay like a monument to someone's very bad day. A Vorkai assault frigate, pre-Empire era judging by the hull configuration, with blast scoring that suggested it had been on the losing side of an argument conducted entirely in weapons fire. The salvage crews had stripped everything valuable, leaving behind the skeleton, and whatever wasn't worth the effort of removing. Standard procedure would have been to leave it alone. The human, operating on standards that had gotten her banned from 12 stations, decided to access is restricted, a salvage foreman said, not looking up from his datapad. The Ythran had 6 eyes, and chose to use exactly none of them for supervision, which explained how the human slipped past while he was cataloging inventory. The frigate's interior smelled like recycled air that had given up in old violence that had settled into the walls. Emergency lighting cast everything in red, giving the corridors the aesthetic of a horror entertainment program's set design. The human's boots crunched on debris as she navigated through passageways that had clearly hosted some excitement, involving explosive decompression and possibly boarding actions. She found the compartment entirely by accident, which was how most disasters began. A panel had been blown inward during whatever final conflict had claimed the ship, revealing a space that should not have existed according to the frigate's blueprint. Inside, past the aforementioned expired rations that smelled like biological warfare, sat a container made from materials that predated modern metallurgy. The container's seals had degraded over time, or possibly decided that keeping their contents secure was someone else's problem. Inside, wrapped in cloth that disintegrated at a touch, lay the weapon. It hummed with potential energy and extremely poor life choices. Well, the human said to nobody in particular, because talking to oneself in abandoned warships was perfectly normal behavior. That's definitely cursed. She picked it up anyway, because humanity's entire evolutionary advantage was apparently making decisions that other species had the good sense to avoid. The weapon felt warm, which was concerning, and seemed to vibrate in harmony with her pulse, which was more concerning, and whispered something in a language that bypassed her ears entirely, and spoke directly to the violence-appreciating parts of her brain, which was extremely concerning but also very interesting. The human examined her find under better lighting back in her ship, running scans that provided increasingly alarming readouts. Her ship's computer, a civilian-grade artificial intelligence with delusions of helpfulness, offered commentary that grew progressively more panic. Warning: unknown energy signature detected. Recommendation: jettison into nearest star. That seems wasteful, the human said, turning the weapon over. The symbols on its surface rearranged themselves, possibly responding to her handling, or possibly just showing off. Warning: weapon matches partial descriptions of banned armaments. Recommendation: cease all physical contact immediately. It's not even turned on. Warning: defining on and off states for this device exceeds my computational parameter. Recommendation: contact station security before this becomes their problem anyway. The human ignored her computer's entirely reasonable suggestions, and did what humans did when encountering ancient weapons of mass destruction. She looked for an instruction manual. The container had yielded several data crystals that her computer refused to interface with, citing self-preservation protocols. She had to find an independent data broker, which led her to the station's lower markets, where legitimate business went to die of embarrassment. The data broker, a Higaran whose species had evolved in high-gravity environments and consequently were built like mobile fortresses, examined the crystals with instruments that looked handmade and probably were. His establishment occupied a corner of the station that even the station's neglected maintenance avoided, filled with technology from a dozen eras in twice as many species. "Where did you acquire these?" the broker asked, his voice resonating through a translator that added bass frequencies for dramatic effect. "Found them." "What's on them?" The broker's three eyes narrowed in sequence. "These are old archive formats. Pre-coalition, possibly pre-contact for some species." He loaded one crystal into a reader that looked like it had been salvaged from a museum's discarded exhibits. "This is either technical documentation or a very elaborate grocery list from civilizations that no longer exist." The data that spilled across his screens made the broker go very still, which was impressive for someone whose species expressed emotion through subtle tremors. "This is documentation for a weapons system. I gathered that much. This is documentation for a weapons system that should not exist, was never supposed to exist again, and whose very existence violates treaties I did not know we had." The broker carefully ejected the crystal like it might detonate. "I cannot read this. I will not read this. I did not see this. You were never here. I'm literally standing right here. Not anymore, you are not." The broker made shooing motions with appendages designed for crushing rocks. "Leave. Take your cursed data. Delete my contact information. If asked, we have never." The human left with her crystals and significantly more questions than answers. She returned to her ship to find station security waiting, which brought everything full circle to the detention cell and the increasingly distressed guard, whose frills were now cycling through colors that suggested his career had taken unexpected turn. But before the arrest, before the alarms and the protocols and the bureaucratic nightmares to come, there had been a moment in the lower markets, when another interested party noticed the human carrying crystals that radiated historical significance. A dealer in exotic arms, operating out of a stall that sold what were definitely not military-grade explosives to civilians, had watched with eyes that calculated profit margins and acceptable risk ratios. "That item," the dealer had said, a grin whose species communicated as much through scent as sound, "you are not understanding what you carry." "People keep saying that," the human had replied, still not seeing anyone offer useful explanations.
Explanations are dangerous. That weapon unmakes things, not destroys. Unmakes, returns them to states of never having been. The mathematics alone violate causality. Sounds useful. The dealer's scent shifted to what the human's limited olfactory senses interpreted as deeply concerned citrus. Useful like fires are useful. Contained, purposeful, brilliant, uncontrolled, civilization ending. Apocalyptic. He had leaned closer. There are parties who would pay excessive amounts for that device. Parties with poor judgment and excessive resources. Not for sale. Everything is for sale at correct prices. The human had smiled that smile, the one that suggested negotiations were over before they began. Not this. I found it. Finders keepers. That conversation had ended with the dealer backing away slowly, and the human attracting exactly the wrong kind of attention, which led to security, which led to the detention cell, which led to the guard's frills achieving new colors that probably indicated his blood pressure was becoming a medical concern. So that's how we got here, the human finished, still spinning the weapon. Any question? The guard stared at her with the expression of someone whose training had not covered this scenario, because no reasonable training program would assume this scenario was possible. So many questions, none of which you will answer helpfully. Probably not, the human agreed cheerfully. So what happens now? What happened now was alarms, protocols, and scientists who were about to have the best day of their careers.
The scientists arrived with the kind of urgency typically reserved for containment breaches and reality-threatening anomalies, which in fairness this situation qualified as both. They flooded into the detention cell in a cascade of different species, each bringing their own sensory apparatus, and deeply held conviction that they were the smartest being in the room. The human watched this parade of academic credentials with the expression of someone who had seen this performance before, and knew exactly how it ended. The lead scientist, a Drellian, whose species had earned 3 Nobel equivalents and 2 restraining orders from physics itself, approached the weapon like it was a theological artifact. His sensory tendrils quivered with what might have been excitement or possibly academic arousal, which for his species occupied the same neurological space. Behind him, a whole department's worth of researchers set up scanning equipment that looked impressively scientific and probably cost more than the human ship. Extraordinary, the scientist breathed, his translator converting his species' harmonic resonances into something approximating language. A functional harbinger device. The theoretical models suggested these were impossible to manufacture even at the height of the precursor civilization. The energy requirements alone would demand harvesting output from collapsing stars. And yet here we are, the human said. Reality continuing to disappoint your theoretical models. The scientist's tendrils twitched in what his species used for indignation. The models are sound. Reality is clearly being uncooperative. He gestured at his team, who deployed sensors that hummed at frequencies that made the guard's frills ache sympathetically. We must document this. Catalog every component. Understand the principles that allow this to function. You could just ask me to demonstrate, the human offered. Every being in the room went very still, the kind of still that suggested prey animals freezing in hopes the predator had not noticed them. Except in this case the predator was holding a weapon capable of editing reality and suggesting she show off. That would be, the scientist chose his words carefully, phenomenally inadvisable. Activating a Harbinger-class device without proper protocols, shielding, and approximately 7 backup containment systems would be tantamount to deliberately causing a cascading reality failure. The human checked the weapon, squinted at what might have been a safety mechanism, and shrugged. Looks fine to me. Please do not, the guard said, his frills now a shade of white that suggested his species' evolutionary fight-or-flight response had chosen a third option. Prey. Please do not activate the weapon that unmakers things. I have forms to file. Many forms. None of them include sections for ontological collapse. The human's finger drifted toward what was definitely a control interface, regardless of what the scientist's increasingly frantic scans suggested. See, the thing is, I have activated it. How do you think I knew it worked? The detention cell's atmosphere achieved a quality of silence that suggested everyone present was simultaneously having religious experiences and cardiac episodes. The lead scientist's tendrils had gone completely rigid, which for his species indicated either deep meditation or total system shutdown. You activated it, he repeated, his translator adding harmonics that translated roughly to screaming internally. Just a little. To test, the human touched a series of symbols on the weapon's surface, which began glowing with light that hurt to perceive directly. Watch this. She aimed at a waste receptacle in the corner and activated some. The weapon made no sound, produced no visible beam, and generated no dramatic effects whatsoever. The waste receptacle simply stopped existing, not in the sense of being destroyed or disintegrated, but in the sense of never having been there at all. The trash it had contained hung in mid-air for a moment, looking confused about its sudden lack of container, before falling to the floor. Neat, right? The human said into the profound silence. It doesn't destroy things, it just convinces reality those things never happened. Very efficient, no cleanup. The scientist's tendrils had begun vibrating at frequencies that suggested several competing nervous breakdowns occurring in parallel. That is not neat. That is causality violation. That is temporal paradox. That is a fundamental assault on the logical consistency of the universe. The universe seems to be handling it fine. The universe is demonstrably not handling it fine. The scientist gestured at where the waste receptacle had been, which was now just empty space and confused garbage. That container existed. It was manufactured, shipped, installed. Beings interacted with it. It had history. Causality chains. And you just erased all of that. To be fair, it was an ugly container. The station's alarm systems, which had been designed by engineers who apparently anticipated situations exactly this stupid, began their warm-up sequence. Klaxons that operated across multiple audio spectrums announced to everyone within 3 sectors that someone had done something phenomenally inadvisable and should probably stop immediately. Station security poured into the area with weapons drawn, which was optimistic, given that the human was holding a device that could theoretically erase them from having ever existed. The guard from earlier looked at his reinforcements, looked at the human, and made a calculation that suggested his retirement plans were looking increasingly appealing. "We need to contain this situation," announced a new voice, and the crowd parted for what was clearly command authority. The station's security chief, a being whose species the human did not recognize but who carried herself with the confidence of someone who had dealt with terrible decisions professionally, assessed the scene with eyes that had seen everything twice and been unimpressed both times. "Explain," she said, in a tone that suggested explanations would not actually help but were required by protocol. The scientist tried. His explanation involved temporal mechanics, causality preservation, and increasingly desperate hand gestures that his species used to convey concepts beyond linguistic expression. The security chief listened with the patience of someone who was mentally composing the incident report and already dreading the paperwork. "So you are telling me," she said when the scientist paused for breath, "that this human found a weapon that rewrites reality, activated it in my station, and has been playing with it like a toy." "When you put it like that, it sounds irresponsible," the human said. "How else would I put it? Scientific curiosity. Bold exploration of ancient technology. Definitely not treasure hunting and restricted salvage." The security chief's expression suggested that her species had evolved facial features specifically to convey the sentiment of being done with everyone's nonsense. "The weapon needs to be secured in a proper containment facility. There are protocols, procedures, forms to file." "See, that's what the guard said," the human replied. "But here's my counterpoint." She activated the weapon again, this time targeting a section of wall that someone had apparently decided the universe could do without. The wall segment ceased existing, revealing the corridor beyond, and several beings who had been eavesdropping and now looked extremely concerned about their life choices. "Stop doing," the scientist shrieked, his translator adding harmonic overtones that suggested his species's version of a panic attack. "I'm making a point," the human said. "This weapon is clearly functional, clearly powerful, and clearly in my possession. So maybe instead of talking about containment and protocols, we should discuss terms." The security chief had that look that command officers got when they realized the situation had evolved beyond standard procedures and into the realm of negotiation with someone who held all the cards, and several cards that should not exist in the deck. "What kind of term?" "The kind where I keep the weapon until I'm done with it, and you don't try to take it by force because we all know how that would end." with you erasing my security force from exist. I was going to say with a lot of paperwork and explaining things to insurance adjusters. But your version works too. The alarm systems had reached peak volume, announcing to 3 sectors that yes, the crisis was still happening, and everyone should remain panicked. Scientists huddled around their instruments, documenting readings that their equipment insisted were impossible while simultaneously recording them. Security forces maintained perimeter positions while carefully not making any moves that might be interpreted as aggressive by the reality-warping weapon holder. "This is insane," the guard from earlier muttered, his frills now permanently stuck on a color that translated to existential resignation. "Welcome to my average Tuesday," the human said, cheerful. The security chief pulled up a communicator, her expression suggesting she was about to ruin someone else's day by involving them in this situation. "Get me high command. Tell them we have a code harbinger situation. Yes, I know those don't exist anymore. Yes, I know they were theoretical. Yes, I am looking at one right now." She paused. "And contact the diplomatic corps. We are going to need people who specialize in impossible negotiations." The human settled back, weapon resting casually in her lap, and smiled. Somewhere in the distance, more alarms joined the chorus. The scientist was having what appeared to be a profound crisis of faith in his understanding of physics. The guard looked like he was composing his resignation letter mentally. "So," the human said into the chaos, "anyone want to hear about the space pirate? Because that part of the story is really good." Nobody wanted to hear about the space pirates, but given that she was holding a weapon that could erase them from ever having existed, they were going to listen anyway. The diplomatic corps arrived with the kind of forced calm that came from years of training and not screaming when circumstances absolutely warranted it. They materialized in the detention area carrying briefcases full of legal frameworks and expressions that suggested they had been pulled from important meetings to deal with this absolute catastrophe. The lead negotiator, a Thundari whose species had evolved specifically for conflict resolution after nearly talking themselves into extinction twice, surveyed the scene with compound eyes that processed information faster than most species could panic. "Let me understand the situation correctly," the negotiator said, mandibles clicking in patterns that the translator rendered as profound weariness. "A human has acquired a Harbinger-class reality disruptor through methods best described as salvage, with questionable legality. This human has demonstrated the weapon's functionality multiple times within station boundaries, creating causality violations that our physicists will be documenting for decades. And now this human is refusing containment protocols, while making what she describes as reasonable demand." "That about covers it," the human agreed, "though I would argue the salvage was entirely legal given the ship was abandoned, and the weapon was undocumented in any official register." "The weapon was undocumented because it was supposed to not exist," the scientist interjected, his tendrils still quivering from earlier trauma. "Documentation implies acknowledgement. Acknowledgement implies someone might look for it. The entire point of sealing these devices was that nobody should ever think about them again. Failed spectacularly on that front," the human observed. The negotiator's mandibles performed a gesture that his species used to convey the sentiment of dealing with children who had found matches and were now discussing fire safety. "The legal framework for this situation is complex. Technically, salvage law does grant ownership of undocumented items recovered from derelict vessels. However, this conflicts with approximately 900 interstellar treaties regarding weapons of mass causality." "Mass causality," the security chief repeated. "Not mass destruction, mass causality. The distinction is important," the scientist said, seizing the opportunity to lecture despite his ongoing nervous breakdown. "Weapons of mass destruction eliminate matter and energy. Messy but understandable. This device eliminates history. It removes things from having ever been. The waste container I watched vanish did not explode or disintegrate. It simply never was. The atoms that composed it still exist somewhere, because they were never assembled into a container. The beings who manufactured it, their records now show they made one fewer container that day. Reality retroactively adjusts to accommodate the absence." "Sounds efficient," the human said. "It is ontologically horrifying." The negotiator raised several appendages in a gesture requesting calm,
which nobody provided because the situation had moved beyond calm into the territory of managed chaos. The question becomes, how do we resolve this situation in a manner that satisfies legal requirements, security concerns, and the human's apparent determination to keep a weapon that unmakes reality? I have a proposal, the human said, and everyone in the room tensed like prey animals hearing a predator's footsteps. You let me keep the weapon temporarily under a salvage claim while proper disposition procedures are established. I agree not to use it except in cases of extreme emergency or really compelling curiosity. You get time to figure out the legal nightmare without anyone getting erased from existence. Everyone wins. That is not everyone winning. The security chiefs. That is everyone not losing catastrophically, which is different. I will take not losing catastrophically, the negotiator admitted. The alternative appears to be attempting forcible confiscation from someone holding a weapon that can delete armed response teams from the timeline. The guard, who had been silent for the past several minutes while contemplating his life choices, finally spoke. This sets a terrible precedent. Humans finding ancient weapons and claiming salvage right. Next you will have independent operators wandering derelicts, looking for reality-warping devices to add to their personal collections. To be fair, the human said, this is probably the only one left. Your predecessors were pretty thorough about the whole sealing away forever thing. I just got lucky. Lucky, the scientist muttered. She calls violating the fundamental compact of civilized species lucky. The negotiator consulted his datapad, scrolling through legal frameworks that had been established by species who never anticipated this exact scenario because no reasonable civilization would. If we proceed with temporary salvage authorization, there would be conditions, extensive conditions. You would need to register the weapon with the Galactic Armament Registry, which will cause approximately 40 different oversight committees to have simultaneous emergencies. You would be restricted from using it in populated systems. You would submit to monitoring protocol. Hard pass on the monitoring, the human said, but I can do registration, and some reasonable usage restrictions. Reasonable usage restrictions, the security chief repeated. For a weapon that edits causality, what would unreasonable restrictions look like? Asking me not to use it at all, the human replied, which defeats the purpose of having found it in the first place. The negotiations continued for another hour, which was impressive given that standard diplomatic processes typically took weeks and involved significantly less threat of ontological collapse. The human demonstrated flexibility on some points, and absolute stubbornness on others, particularly regarding any restrictions that would interfere with what she described as necessary operational freedom. The negotiator demonstrated remarkable patience for someone whose species communicated partially through pheromones that currently smelled like burnt stress. The final agreement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic compromise that satisfied absolutely nobody while preventing immediate disaster. The human would retain possession of the weapon under emergency salvage provisions, pending final disposition hearings that would probably last years. She would agree not to use it, except in self-defense or situations she determined to be sufficiently interesting, which was a loophole large enough to fly a cargo hauler through but was the best the negotiator could manage. The station would not attempt confiscation, provided she departed within 12 hours, and did not return until the legal situation was resolved. This is the worst agreement I have ever negotiated, the negotiator said, mandibles clicking in patterns that translated to deep dissatisfaction. But it is an agreement, the security chief noted, which means I can file this as resolved instead of ongoing crisis. Your paperwork does not reflect the fundamental absurdity of this outcome. My paperwork never does. That is why I drank. The human stood, weapon secured in a holster she had apparently been wearing the entire time, which raised questions about whether she could have escaped whenever she wanted. Pleasure doing business with you all. Very professional. Much appreciated. Please leave my station, the security chief said. Immediately, before you find anything else. I make no promises, the human replied, which was not reassuring to anyone present. As she departed, escorted by security forces, who maintained careful distance, and looked ready to run if she so much as touched the weapon, the scientist watched with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had been permanently damaged. She is going to cause an incident, multiple incidents, cascading incidents that historians will document as the beginning of the end. Probably the negotiator agreed, but not today. Today we have achieved bureaucratic miracle of postponing catastrophe indefinitely. That is not a miracle, that is institutional cowardice. In my profession, there is frequently no difference. The human's ship departed 3 hours later, ahead of schedule because apparently she was eager to leave before anyone reconsidered the agreement. Station sensors tracked her trajectory until she jumped to faster than light travel, taking with her a weapon that 3 civilizations had died to keep hidden and that she had found behind expired military rations. In the detention cell, now empty except for the garbage on the floor where a waste receptacle had once been and now never was, the guard stood with his frills cycling through colors that suggested profound philosophical crisis. She found it, he said to nobody in particular, just found it, behind spoiled food, and now she has a weapon that can erase things from history. Humans find things, the security chief said, reviewing incident reports that would require explanations she did not have. It is apparently what they do: find things, keep things, use things in ways the original manufacturers never intended. The original manufacturers sealed it away specifically so nobody would use it. And 3 weeks later, reports began filtering through intelligence networks about a human matching the description, who had used an unidentified weapon to resolve a pirate blockade by erasing the lead pirate ship from existence. The pirates had immediately surrendered, partly from fear and partly from existential confusion about whether their flagship had ever actually existed or if they had collective false memory. 4 weeks after that, an archaeological team reported that someone had removed a temporal lock from a restricted site by convincing reality the lock had never been installed. Security footage showed a human woman with a distinctive weapon, whistling cheerfully as causality bent around. 2 months later, the Galactic Armament Registry received formal registration papers for one Harbinger-class reality disruptor, listed under found property, with a salvage claim number and a note that said, "Still using it." The negotiator reviewing these reports in his office, while consuming substances his species used to manage stress, composed a message to the relevant authorities. It read simply, "As predicted, human has caused incidents. Recommend we establish permanent monitoring. Also recommend we search all remaining derelicts immediately before humans find anything else." The security chief, receiving similar reports, added a note to the humans file that read, "Banned from Epsilon 9 station, forever. Seriously, I do not care about the salvage law. She is not allowed back, ever." The scientist, having published 17 papers about the brief time he had observed a functional Harbinger device, received tenure and a research grant to study theoretical causality preservation. His acceptance speech included the phrase, "I have looked into the face of physics crying in despair and cannot unsee it." The guard, having been promoted for handling the situation without anyone getting erased from existence, trained new security officers with one core lesson: if a human says they found something, assume it is dangerous, assume it should not exist, and assume they are going to keep it regardless of what you do. Prepare accordingly. And somewhere in the black between stars, a human flew a cargo hauler with questionable documentation, and a weapon that unmade things, humming cheerfully and thinking about what other interesting salvage might be waiting in forgotten places. She checked her scanner, noted a derelict cruiser that the charts listed as stripped clean, and smiled that smile. "Found it," she said to nobody in particular, adjusting course toward what was definitely going to be someone else's problem eventually. Finders keepers. Behind her, reality adjusted itself slightly, accommodating one more impossible thing that absolutely should not be wandering around the galaxy in the hands of someone who considered found it behind expired food and acceptable acquisition story. The universe, vast and indifferent and increasingly confused about its own continuity, simply sighed and kept spinning. It had survived worse than humans finding things. Probably, the historical records were getting difficult to verify given recent causality violation. In the detention cell on Epsilon 9, the garbage still sat on the floor where a waste receptacle had never been, eternal monument to the day someone found something and decided keeping it was a perfectly reasonable decision. The guard walked past it daily, frills shifting through colors that meant, I am too tired for this. And why did I choose this career? The answer, of course, was that someone had to deal with the consequences of humans finding things. It was not glamorous work. It was not well-compensated work, but it was, apparently necessary work, at least until someone found something even more impossible, and the cycle began again. Finders keepers, after all.